Eli Mercer was on one knee in the middle of Bay 3 when the men in pressed suits came down from the overlook and found him dragging a yellow chalk line across a seam in the concrete. The first one laughed because it looked easy to laugh at him, a gray-haired widower in a faded work jacket with a tape measure clipped to his belt, one knee wet from floor dust, drawing on the ground as if he were warning children not to cross a street. The second man, younger and louder, asked whether the plant's new billion-dollar press line was supposed to be afraid of sidewalk art. Eli did not look up. He set the chalk down beside his worn plumb bob, laid 2 fingers on the seam as though he could feel the building breathing through it, and watched the tiny needle of an old dial gauge quiver against the black mark he had made on a fixed column before sunrise. "The floor's walking," he said. "Not the machines. The floor." The laughter thinned, but only for a second. Then Reed Kessler, the operations chief, stepped forward in his polished shoes and scuffed half the line into a yellow smear before anyone with real authority had a chance to study it. He told the others not to humor superstition during the most important demonstration in the company's history. Eli rose slowly, chalk dust on his palm, and kept his voice as calm as church bells on a cold Sunday morning. "That line wasn't holding anything in place," he said. "It was only showing you what moved." No one answered him. Above them, on the visitor's balcony, the chief executive of Halcyon Freight Systems stood behind glass with a cup of untouched coffee in her hand, watching a man she had almost never noticed become the quiet center of a problem no one wanted to name. 31 minutes later, when 12 synchronized stamping presses came down together with the heavy, perfect rhythm of money and ambition, the concrete under Bay 3 moaned, the light swung hard enough to throw white arcs across the ceiling, and the entire floating production slab shifted 3 inches toward the west wall. After that, not one man in the building wanted to talk about chalk. The plant sat outside Toledo where the land flattened toward the lake and the winter wind carried the smell of wet steel, corn stubble, and diesel exhaust across the service roads. Halcyon called the facility Foundry West, though nothing there was old enough to deserve such a name. It was all silver panels, glass corridors, clean safety stripes, polished concrete, and sensor screens that glowed blue in the dim hours before the morning shift. The company had built it to manufacture the frame assemblies for battery-powered long-haul trucks, and the new line was supposed to save Halcyon from becoming another Midwestern manufacturer with a glorious past and a shrinking future. 12 German-built servo presses, each as tall as a 2-story house, sat on an isolated seismic slab designed to protect the machines from ground vibration and keep the tolerances tight enough that human inspection would become almost symbolic. The engineers loved saying that. Human inspection would become symbolic. The machines watched themselves, corrected themselves, reported themselves, and measured themselves against a digital twin that hovered on control room screens like a ghost without doubt. Eli had never trusted anything that could not be checked from outside its own story. His father had been a tool and die man in Flint, a quiet man with scarred hands who believed in 2 rules: keep a true edge on your knives and never take a measurement from the thing that is already moving. Eli had carried that lesson through 21 years of factory maintenance, through one unfinished associate engineering program he had left when his wife got sick, through nights driving a tow truck after work to pay for his daughter's braces and hospital bills, and through the long season after Mara Mercer died, when the only way he knew to grieve was to keep showing up where things were broken and put them back in line. He arrived at Foundry West at 4:38 that morning with a thermos of burnt coffee, a canvas tool bag, and a folded note from his daughter Lila in his lunch pail that said, "Don't forget, you promised pancakes Saturday." The note had a little drawing of a skillet under it. He read it in the truck before he went inside, smiled despite the cold, and tucked it back carefully, because when you were raising a 14-year-old alone, promises were not decorations. They were beams. Inside the plant, the air was warm and chemical sweet with curing sealant and hydraulic oil. Amber standby lights blinked along the press frames. A cleaning robot hummed near the safety rail. Eli walked his usual path along the edge of the isolated slab, boots scraping faintly over concrete that had been poured in a hurry the previous spring and certified by people who had never crawled beneath it. At the expansion joint near column D14, his boot tapped differently. He stopped. There were sounds most people missed because they expected problems to announce themselves in alarms. Eli knew better. A joint could tell you things. A cart rolling a foot in the wrong direction could tell you things. A wrench left on a level plate could tell you if the whole world under it had tilted while everybody was looking at screens. He set his spirit level down, waited for the bubble to settle, and felt a tired heaviness move through him. It was not much. It was barely anything. But it leaned west. He measured the joint in 3 places, comparing the numbers against the little notebook he kept in his breast pocket. The east side had narrowed since last week. The west side had opened by almost the same amount. That was not a slab settling on one corner. That was a slab translating, moving as a single raft. He took out the old Starrett dial gauge his father had given him when Eli was 19, clamped it to a fixed service column outside the floating slab, and set the probe against a steel tab mounted on the slab edge. The red needle was not dramatic. It did not spin or jump. It simply sat where it should not have been, nearly half an inch off the mark he had set 5 days earlier. Eli looked toward the rows of silent presses, then up at the dark glass of the control room where every system status was green. He already knew what the screens would say before he checked them, but he checked anyway. Alignment, normal. Lateral displacement, normal. Anchor load, normal. Rail geometry, normal. Everything normal, because every sensor that mattered had been bolted to the same moving island. The system could see the distance between one press and another. It could see the rails, the transfer arms, the machine bases, the internal datum marks. But if the whole slab drifted together, the system would congratulate itself on perfect agreement while the building walked away from the world. He found Tessa Vale in the instrumentation room, hair twisted up with a pencil through it, sweatshirt sleeves pushed to her elbows, 2 monitors reflecting blue light in her tired eyes. Tessa was not like Reed Kessler or Blaine Harrow, the chief engineer who presented models like sermons. She listened before she defended herself. She had worked her way through night school at Bowling Green, had a habit of checking assumptions twice, and had once told Eli that machines were honest until people taught them what not to see. He showed her the notebook, then the gauge. She followed him down to the joint without making a joke. When he explained what he thought was happening, she pulled up the sensor map on her tablet, pinched and dragged through 3 layers of system architecture, and went still. "There's no outside reference," she whispered. "Not one on the fixed structure?" Eli asked, though he already knew. She shook her head slowly. "All the primary displacement points are on the slab or tied to equipment frames on the slab. The only external feeds are environmental, cameras, door states, conduit tension. Nothing measuring slab to foundation continuously. The plant around them seemed too quiet then, the way a house feels quiet after someone says the word fire." Eli took the chalk box from his bag, snapped a line across the joint from the fixed corridor floor to the slab edge, and wrote 5:16 a.m. in square block numbers. Tessa watched the line, then the gap, then him. "They won't delay," she said. "Behringer's people land at 9. Adelaide Quinn has the board watching live. Reed has half of Columbus invited to the signing dinner." "I'm not asking them to delay because of chalk," Eli said. "I'm asking them to verify the lateral restraints with an outside datum before they run all 12 presses in sync." Tessa gave him a look that carried more fear than argument. Everyone in Foundry West knew what the demonstration meant. Halcyon was trying to win a 9-year production agreement with Behringer Continental, the largest privately owned freight carrier still buying American-built chassis at scale. Without that contract, Foundry West would run at partial capacity. Layoffs would start by summer, and the company's lenders would begin using words that made ordinary workers clean out lockers. With it, there would be steady wages, apprenticeships, supplier orders, health insurance, overtime, and a reason for young mechanics to stay in Ohio instead of leaving for warehouses in Texas. Eli knew all of that. He also knew a plant full of people could get hurt because powerful men were embarrassed by a small warning. "Then we make them hear it," he said. Tessa sent an urgent note up the chain with attached photos, gauge readings, and a recommendation for a temporary hold. Eli added his own maintenance report. At 6:21, Reed Kessler replied with 6 words: "Bring Mercer to the executive review." The review was held in the glass conference room above the production floor, where visitors could look down on the presses like generals studying a battlefield they would never have to cross. Blaine Harrow stood near the screen in a charcoal suit, lean and silver-haired, with the smooth impatience of a man who had learned that credentials could be used like locked doors. Reed stood beside him, restless, jaw tight, already angry that the morning had developed an unscripted event. Adelaide Quinn, Halcyon's chief executive, stood by the window in a cream-colored coat, arms folded, face unreadable. She had inherited a wounded company from her father and spent 6 years convincing investors she could make it modern without making it hollow. Eli respected that from a distance. He also knew distance was where people like him usually stayed. Around the table sat senior engineers, finance officers, legal counsel, and 2 public relations staffers who looked frightened by anything that could not be phrased as progress. Eli stood at the end of the table with his notebook open. He described the joint differential, the westward slope, the gauge reading from a fixed column, and the absence of external reference sensors. He kept it plain. No speech, no accusation. Just facts laid down in order. Blaine waited until he finished, then asked whether Eli understood that the plant was fitted with more than 5,000 calibrated measurement points, operating at a precision beyond the capacity of any handheld tool in that building. Eli said he did. Blaine smiled without warmth. "And yet your conclusion is that a maintenance supervisor with a chalk box has discovered a structural movement invisible to the most advanced industrial sensor network in North America." A few people at the table smiled. Reed looked relieved to hear the issue becoming ridiculous. Eli did not raise his voice. "If you put every clock on the same train, they'll all agree on the time while the train leaves the station." A young engineer coughed into his fist to hide a laugh. Someone muttered something about folk wisdom. Blaine asked which engineering program Eli had completed, and the room changed temperature. Tessa, standing near the wall, looked down. Eli closed the notebook gently. "I didn't finish." "So you are asking this room," Blaine said, "to suspend a contract demonstration representing more than $800 million in projected revenue because you have a partial education, a chalk mark, and a tool older than some of the equipment operators." Eli glanced through the glass at the yellow line below. "I'm asking you to take one measurement from something that is not moving." Reed turned away with a sharp laugh, went down the stairs, and walked onto the production floor. Everyone watched through the glass as he crossed Bay 3, bent only enough to set his shoe against Eli's line, and smeared it across the joint in a bright, ugly streak. Then he came back up, breathing harder than he should have been, and said, "We are not showing Behringer Continental a floor covered in panic marks." Adelaide had not laughed. That mattered, but not enough. She looked at Blaine and asked, "Is this facility safe to operate under the approved demonstration plan?" Blaine answered immediately, "Yes, with full confidence. With the confidence of the data, the commissioning record, and the signed structural certification." Adelaide turned to Eli. For a second, he thought she might ask him something real. Instead, she said, "Mr. Mercer, you'll remain off the production floor during the client demonstration. Tessa, continue routine monitoring." It was a careful executive sentence, not cruel and not kind, built to keep the morning moving. Eli nodded once. Before leaving, he paused near the far stairwell and made 2 small chalk ticks at the edge of the expansion joint where the safety rail cast a shadow. One near column D14, another near column H2. Tessa followed him with her eyes. Down the corridor, she caught up and asked, "Why mark it again after that?" Eli looked back through the glass at the smeared line. "Because when people finally believe the floor moved, they're going to argue about how far." Caleb Berenger arrived at 9:12 in a dark blue Suburban behind 2 vans carrying engineers, attorneys, and financial analysts. He was not the kind of rich man Reed had prepared for. There was no silk tie, no gold watch flashing at his cuff, no entourage arranged to make him seem taller. Caleb wore a brown canvas jacket over a white shirt and walked with the slight forward lean of a man who had spent years loading freight before he ever owned any. His grandfather had started with 2 trucks hauling canned tomatoes out of Indiana. Caleb had grown Behringer Continental into a national carrier by distrusting anything that looked too polished to touch. He liked plants with oil stains in the right places and workers who could answer questions without glancing at executives first. That made Reed nervous, though he covered it with charm. The production hall had been staged like a television set. Fresh banners hung from the mezzanine. 4 giant screens displayed animated models of the press cycle. Sections of the facility that were still incomplete had been hidden behind clean white panels printed with renderings of what they would look like by the 3rd quarter. The company's board watched through a private video feed from Chicago. A photographer moved quietly along the rail. Blaine gave the technical presentation, describing Foundry West as an adaptive manufacturing platform capable of identifying and correcting misalignment before it became visible to operators. Eli, standing behind a narrow maintenance window 2 levels down because his badge had been restricted from the floor, heard that sentence through the building audio and rubbed his thumb along the edge of his old gauge. He had been sent to the utility level to inspect hydraulic filter logs, which was a useful way to put him where no client would see him. The basement under Bay 3 was low, gray, and loud with pumps. Pipes ran overhead in painted bundles. He could feel the plant through his boots, not as a metaphor but as vibration, small test cycles at first, then heavier pulses as the system warmed. He sat on an upturned crate with a printed schematic across his knees and listened to the rhythm. Years of factory work had taught him that repetition was a language. A bad bearing spoke in a roughened whisper. A loose mount struck the same note half a beat late. A slab beginning to resonate had a slow gathering under it, like a crowd inhaling before a shout. His phone buzzed. "Lila," he answered with one finger in his other ear. "Hey, Bug. You sound like you're inside a washing machine," she said. "Close enough. Are you coming home normal time?" Normal time was a phrase they used carefully because nothing about their life had been normal after Mara's illness. It meant dinner before homework, not vending machine food. It meant he would look at her algebra instead of falling asleep in his boots. It meant their little house on Finch Street would feel less empty for a few hours. "I'm going to try," he said. "That means maybe. It means I'm going to try hard." She was quiet for a second. "Is the big thing today?" "Yes." "Are they being jerks?" Eli smiled, despite himself. "Eat something besides cereal when you get home." "That's not an answer. It's the dad answer." She sighed in the dramatic way 14-year-olds do when love embarrasses them. "Okay, Pancake Saturday. You promised." "I remember." After the call ended, he sat still for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then a binder on the shelf beside him caught his eye. Receiving packets from the installation phase, stored where no visitor would ever look. He had reviewed most of them weeks earlier while chasing a mismatch in the restraint load status reports. Now he pulled the binder down and spread the pages over the crate. The permanent lateral restraint anchors, 4 assemblies of forged steel with rated capacity high enough to hold the floating slab centered during full synchronized operation, had been delivered 8 weeks before. There were signatures from the loading dock. There were barcodes. There were case numbers. What was missing was the installation report. Eli turned pages faster. The completion file claimed the anchors were installed and verified. The warehouse file said they were received and stored. No transfer, no torque record, no inspection photo, no final sign-off by the field crew. His stomach tightened. He called Tessa. She answered in a whisper from somewhere near the control station. "I found the anchors," he said. "Found them where?" "On paper, they came in. There's no record they went under the slab." "That can't be right. Pull the change orders for restraint hardware. Look for anything Blaine approved late May." He heard her typing. The presentation audio muffled behind her, then nothing for several seconds. "Eli," she said, and the way she said his name told him she had found it. Temporary positioning brackets substituted during final commissioning. Permanent anchors deferred pending schedule clearance. Deferred? The final status says closed. Closed isn't installed. Above him, the first demonstration cycle began, low and controlled, and the concrete trembled as if something very large had turned in its sleep. At 25% load, Foundry West looked magnificent. The transfer arms slid aluminum blanks into position with delicate certainty. The presses descended in sequence, each movement smooth enough to make danger seem theoretical. On the balcony, guests watched with the reverent expression people wear when expensive things obey. Reed moved among them, whispering numbers. Adelaide stood beside Caleb Barringer, not selling too hard, because she was wise enough to know that Caleb disliked being sold. Blaine spoke from the control station about tolerance envelopes, damping systems, predictive correction, and closed-loop stability. Tessa stood behind the instrumentation console with a tablet held too tightly. She had mounted her personal inspection camera on a fixed handrail outside the floating slab, partly because Eli had asked, and partly because by then she needed to know whether she was frightened for a reason. At first, the video showed nothing obvious. Then, at 50% load, a hairline shift appeared between the slab edge and the stationary corridor wall in the background. It was not a dramatic movement. It was worse. It was steady. The slab was creeping west in tiny increments, each press cycle ratcheting the movement forward while the internal sensors insisted everything remained aligned. Tessa brought the feed to Blaine. "We need to pause and verify against the fixed structure," she said. Blaine glanced at the video, then at the client group. "Camera shake. The camera is bolted to the fixed rail. Then the rail is vibrating. The rail is outside the slab. Tessa." He said her name like a warning. "Do not create a shutdown event from a consumer camera artifact. It matches Mercer's gauge reading." Reed heard that and stepped in. "Mercer is not part of this demonstration." Tessa lowered her voice. "The slab is translating." Reed's eyes flicked toward Caleb, who had turned slightly, listening. "Enough." In the basement, Eli had drawn a rough frequency calculation on the back of a filter inventory sheet. The 12 presses running in synchronized demonstration mode were approaching a lateral resonance range he had worried about during installation, a range the permanent anchors were supposed to make uneventful. With temporary positioning brackets instead, every stroke was not just vertical force. It produced a small side load, tiny by itself, repeated and amplified by rhythm. He called Tessa again. "Stop before 75, he said. "At 75, those brackets will start giving instead of resisting." "I'm trying." "Don't try quietly." Eli. The line clicked, then filled with the flat tone of a disconnected call. A minute later, a security supervisor came down the utility stairs with an apologetic look and asked for Eli's company phone. "Instruction from operations," he said. "Personal phone too?" Eli asked. The man looked away. "Company phone." Eli handed it over. He did not blame the guard. A plant teaches people where their paychecks come from. But he took the stairs two at a time to the production-level access door and pressed his badge to the reader. Red. Denied. Through the reinforced glass, he could see the western expansion joint and the shadowed tick mark near column D14. It had separated cleanly. The two halves no longer met across the joint. He struck the glass with his palm. "Shut it down!" The sound vanished under the next press cycle. A plastic water bottle on the control console began sliding west. At first only Tessa saw it. Then one of Caleb's engineers saw it. Then Adelaide Quinn saw it and stopped pretending she was watching numbers. The bottle moved with slow, undeniable obedience to gravity or movement or both, passing the edge of a tablet and tapping softly against a keyboard. Caleb turned to Reed. "Why is that moving?" Reed looked at Blaine. Blaine looked at the screens, which remained green. "Surface vibration," he said, but the words landed badly because no one could see the bottle vibrating. It was traveling. Adelaide's face had gone pale in a way that made her look younger and older at the same time. Tessa stepped forward, voice shaking now but clear. "The slab has moved nearly an inch since morning. We need an emergency stop." Blaine's mouth tightened. "We are still within designed lateral float limits." "For an earthquake," Tessa said, "not for self-induced drift during production." Caleb's lead structural consultant, a woman named Dr. Alana Price, moved toward the joint with her own laser measure. Reed tried to block her by suggesting safety protocols. Caleb said, "Let her look." The load sequence climbed. Someone had failed to cancel the programmed ramp to 90%. Blaine saw it, hesitated, and in that hesitation revealed the whole disease. Stopping required an explanation, and the explanation would include the man with the chalk. The presses rose, paused, and descended together. Beneath the floor came a sharp metallic crack, a sound too bright to belong to hydraulics. Eli heard it through the access door and slammed his palm against the glass again. The security supervisor reached him but did not grab him. He had heard it too. The second cycle came down and the slab jumped west roughly an inch. The overhead lights swung. A flexible conduit snapped against its bracket. A transfer arm paused mid-path, recalculated, and moved again because its reference frame believed the corridor had shifted, not the machines. On the third cycle, 3 temporary brackets failed in sequence, the sound traveling under the floor like a steel zipper being torn open. The entire production island moved, not collapsed, not exploded, not in the spectacular way disasters appear in movies, but with the terrifying composure of mass obeying force. 12 presses, rails, platforms, cable trays, tool cabinets, and every sensor mounted on the slab shifted west together until the secondary buffer system caught it with a deep, muffled impact that everyone felt in the teeth. Emergency stop alarms finally screamed, not because the alignment system understood what had happened, but because the fixed conduits stretched to their limit and tripped protective switches. The screen still showed nominal alignment. That was the most damning thing of all. In the sudden red light and siren wash, Caleb walked to column D14, crouched with difficulty because his knees were not young, and looked at the little yellow tick Eli had left in the shadow. Its two halves were separated by 3 inches. He did not touch it. He stood and faced Adelaide. "Who marked this?" Reed said, "A maintenance employee made unauthorized floor markings earlier." Caleb looked at him for a long, empty second. "That maintenance employee knew your factory was moving before your factory did. No one was hurt, which let certain people speak as if nothing serious had happened. That began almost immediately. Reed used the phrase controlled emergency response before the alarms had stopped. Blaine told Adelaide the buffer system had performed exactly as designed, as though a parachute opening after a pilot ignored smoke in the cockpit proved the flight had been a success. The client demonstration was suspended, but not yet lost. Caleb gave Halcyon until close of business to produce a verified safe condition, a credible technical explanation, and unrestricted access to records. If they could not, he would move the contract to a competing plant in Kentucky that had already cleared preliminary review. It was a brutal condition, but not an unfair one. "I don't punish mistakes," Caleb told Adelaide while engineers photographed the shifted joint. "I punish concealment. Right now, I don't know which one I'm looking at." Adelaide had no answer. She sent for Eli. Reed found him in the utility level sitting on the bottom stair, his tool bag at his feet, his old gauge in his lap, and his face drawn not with triumph, but exhaustion. Reed did not apologize. Men like Reed treated apology as a resource to be released only when legally necessary. "We need you upstairs," he said. "There's an alignment issue." Eli looked up slowly. "No," he said. "There's a foundation reference issue and an unrestrained slab issue. Alignment is what you call it when machines are wrong with each other. This is the whole floor wrong with the world." Reed's jaw flexed. "You can either help restore the line or explain to human resources why you refused a direct order during an emergency." Eli rubbed chalk dust from the crease of his thumb. His hands were steady, but his eyes showed the cost of the morning. He had been dismissed, mocked, locked out, and proven right in the worst possible way, which is to say proven right after danger has already passed through the room. "Before I touch anything," he said, "I want 4 things documented." Reed gave a short laugh. "You're bargaining? I'm protecting the record. Same thing from where I'm standing. That's why I'm asking for it in writing." He counted on his fingers, not dramatically, just clearly. "First, my warning was submitted before the demonstration and declined by operations and engineering. Second, any restoration work I perform reports directly to Ms. Quinn or the board safety representative, not through the same chain that dismissed the warning. Third, no blame for missing anchor installation gets pushed onto maintenance, technicians, or night shift crews who had no authority to approve that change. Fourth, the incident report describes what happened in physical terms, not phrases designed to make nobody responsible." Reed leaned closer. "Careful, Eli." Eli met his eyes. "I've been careful all day. That's what everyone found annoying." Adelaide arrived before Reed could answer, with Caleb, Dr. Price, Tessa, and 2 board members on video through a tablet carried by legal counsel. The sirens had stopped, leaving the plant in a hollow quiet broken only by pump motors and murmured voices. Adelaide looked different without the balcony glass between them. She looked like a person whose decisions had weight and had suddenly felt it. "Mr. Mercer," she said, then paused, perhaps realizing she had never called him anything else. "Eli, what do you need?" It was the first useful question anyone with authority had asked him. He stood, knees stiff, and unrolled a floor plan across a workbench. "The slab has to be returned to center with the hydraulic jacking system, but not on the automated restore program. That program reads the same internal references that missed the drift. If it believes the current location is true, it may apply uneven correction. We need fixed points from the outer foundation, 3 minimum, preferably 4, and we move the slab in 1/8-inch steps with full stop checks after every increment. No continuous push, no model-only correction. After center is verified, the permanent restraint anchors get installed and torqued before a single press cycles again." Blaine, who had followed Adelaide down, objected at once. "This is field improvisation. The jacking system was designed for automated recentering. The stress distribution has already been modeled." Eli pointed to the plan. Your model assumes uniform friction across all bearing pads. That is the certified condition. Was it certified before or after the slab spent weeks running on temporary brackets? Blaine said nothing. If one pad binds and you push continuous, you rotate the slab. Then you're not down for a day. You're down for months. Dr. Price looked at the plan, then at Ely. Where are the southern quadrant valves? Blaine started to answer, stopped, and glanced at the schematic as though it might rescue him. Eli tapped 4 points with his pencil. Here, behind the coolant manifold, and the last one in the crawl space west of the sump. The labels are wrong on the as-built drawings. They swapped 2 during installation. Tessa looked at him sharply. How do you know that? I was under there when they did it. Caleb's expression did not change, but his attention settled fully on Eli in a way no title could have purchased. Adelaide turned to Blaine. Do you dispute the valve locations? Blaine's silence answered. She looked back at Eli. Proceed with your sequence. Reed opened his mouth. Adelaide cut him off without raising her voice. Reed, find the permanent anchors. I'm not sure they're on site. Eli reached into his folder and handed over the receiving manifest. Aisle K, industrial storage. 4 sealed crates, unless they've moved since yesterday. Reed took the paper. His face changed in small increments as he read the delivery date. Caleb saw it. Adelaide saw Caleb seeing it. The plant's problem was no longer only mechanical. It had become moral, documentary, and legal, which meant the room finally understood what maintenance workers had always known. A missing bolt can be a signature. The restoration work began without ceremony. Eli refused the control room because the control room had lied beautifully all morning, so he set up at a steel workbench near the western joint with a wired headset, his paper plan, 2 mechanical comparators, Tessa's fixed cameras, and Dr. Price's independent laser equipment tied to columns that were not part of the slab. The engineers who had smiled at him before sunrise now stood around his chalk diagram on the concrete copying instructions in silence. Eli assigned them by competence, not by rank. Tessa took external measurement and data capture. Dr. Price handled structural verification. A young controls engineer named Jonah managed pump timing because his hands were quick and he listened carefully. 2 maintenance mechanics went under the slab to watch conduits and bearing pads. Blaine was permitted to observe, but not direct. Reed was sent to the warehouse with a forklift operator and returned 20 minutes later behind 4 sealed crates of anchor assemblies, each one carrying the manufacturer's label, the delivery date, and the shame of having been exactly where the paperwork said they were not. Eli did not look satisfied when he saw them. Satisfaction was for arguments. This was work. The first 1/8-inch correction moved cleanly. Tessa called out the displacement from a fixed camera. 2.875 west. Jonah eased off the valves. Eli checked the comparator, wrote the number, and nodded for the next increment. Again. The operation developed a rhythm completely unlike the press demonstration. No music, no screens for visitors, no confidence borrowed from animation, just people calling numbers, checking each other, and waiting for the physical world to agree. At the 1-inch recovery mark, pressure rose in the southwest cluster without corresponding movement. Blaine, unable to stop himself, said, "Sensor lag." Eli shut all clusters down. "No movement until we know." "Every pause burns time," Reed said from the edge of the bay. Eli put on his hard hat. "Every shortcut spent it." He entered the crawl space through a rectangular hatch near the conduit trench. It was tight, concrete on one side and the underside of the slab above him, the air hot with oil smell and metal dust. Eli's shoulder scraped as he pulled himself forward with a flashlight in his teeth. He found the bind 10 feet in. A shard from one failed temporary bracket wedged against a bearing rail, catching the slab like a stone under a sled runner. He called for a pry bar and a cold chisel. For 22 minutes he worked in a space too narrow to turn around, sweat running into his eyes, forearms burning, while men above him stood uselessly near equipment worth millions. When the metal fragment broke free, it struck the crawlspace floor with a small, bright ring. Eli carried it out in his palm and set it on the workbench. No one joked. At 2 inches, the main power conduit reached its safe extension limit. Eli ordered a transfer to auxiliary power to relax the load before continuing. Reed objected because a power transfer would be logged as a production interruption during a client recovery window. Caleb, standing nearby with his hands in his jacket pockets, said, "Mr. Kessler, the log is not the problem. The problem is what you keep trying to keep out of it." Reed flushed and said nothing. The lights dimmed, died for 12 seconds, then returned on auxiliary. Eli waited for every system to stabilize, then continued. The final half-inch took nearly an hour because the slab resisted in tiny, stubborn ways, as if the building itself had developed mistrust. Eli did not rush it. He called for measurements after every movement, sometimes twice, sometimes from all 4 fixed points. When the slab reached center within a 1/16 of an inch, he did not celebrate. He ran his hand over the joint, checked the comparator, and said, "Lock it." The permanent anchors were installed under Dr. Price's supervision, torqued in sequence, photographed, stamped, and recorded with more witnesses than the company had ever used for a single hardware operation. Only after that did Eli allow limited power to the press controls. A 40% verification run was scheduled, not to impress anyone, but to prove the plant could operate without lying to itself. Before it began, Adelaide approached Eli near the joint. "I should have listened," she said. It was not the public apology the moment would later require, but it was the first human one. Eli looked through the bay where people moved carefully now, no longer acting as if urgency made them larger than consequences. "You had a lot of people telling you not to," he said. "That isn't an excuse." "No. Then don't waste it." She studied him for a moment. "Waste what?" "The part where nobody got killed. The 40% run went clean. The presses cycled. The fixed comparators held steady. The external sensors remained flat. Aluminum blanks moved through the line and came out true. For the first time all day, the building did what it said it was doing. That should have been enough to steady the room, but it did something else instead. It made the morning's choices look even worse, because now everyone could see how simple the missing safeguards had been. A reference outside the slab. Anchors installed as specified. A field warning treated as evidence instead of nuisance. Not miracles. Not genius. Just discipline. While technicians secured the line, Reed and Blaine moved the fight upstairs, where damage could be wrapped in language. In a third-floor conference room with the blinds closed, they assembled an incident draft before Eli had washed the grease from his arms. The first version described the event as an unanticipated resonance interaction within a validated isolation envelope. It stated that the demonstration had revealed a rare dynamic condition not reasonably detectable through standard commissioning procedures. It credited the recovery to cross-functional collaboration under executive oversight. Eli appeared in paragraph 7 as maintenance support personnel. Tessa's early camera verification was called supplemental visual review. The missing permanent anchors were described as hardware pending final implementation under an approved phased installation approach. Every sentence was smooth enough to slide responsibility across the table without leaving fingerprints. Adelaide sat at the end of the room listening. She was tired in a way she had not been at dawn. Running a company had taught her that some crises were survived by narrowing the official story until it could pass through legal review without tearing. But something about the chalk dust still visible near the cuff of her coat kept disturbing that instinct. Caleb had given them a path forward, but not a clean one. The board wanted containment. Legal wanted careful wording. Investors wanted continuity. Workers wanted jobs. The public would eventually want an explanation. And inside all of that sat a man with no degree who had seen the truth early and been punished for seeing it from the wrong rung of the ladder. Blaine argued that no report should elevate an informal chalk marking to the status of technical evidence. Reed added that Eli's conduct before the event could be construed as disruptive, which was a foolish thing to say in front of a woman who had just watched his disruption save the plant from greater damage. Still, the old machinery of reputation was turning. It had gears older than Foundry West. Then Tessa walked in without being invited, carrying a folder and a laptop. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "Before this gets signed, the record needs to include these items." Reed snapped. "This is an executive session." Tessa set the folder on the table. Then the executives should want the complete record. She opened with the metadata from her early photographs of Eli's chalk marks, time-stamped before the demonstration ramp and geotagged inside Bay 3. She added the access logs showing Eli's badge had been disabled after he submitted his warning. She showed the communication record of his call urging a halt before the 75% threshold, followed by the operations action that cut off his company phone. She produced the sensor topology map, proving that the primary system lacked an external displacement reference. Then came the change order Blaine had approved, substituting temporary positioning brackets for permanent anchors during final commissioning, marked closed without an independent safety review. Last was Reed's message to the project team the previous evening. All open installation items must be cleared before Behringer arrival. No exceptions visible after 700. Reed said the words meant administrative cleanup. Tessa said, then why did 4 crates of safety-critical hardware remain unopened in storage while the completion file marked them installed? Blaine's attorney, already present though no one had said why, advised him not to answer. Silence took the room. It was not the useful silence of reflection. It was the caught silence of people discovering that the exit they expected had been locked from the outside. Adelaide looked at the draft report, then at Tessa's folder, then through the interior window to the production floor below, where Eli was standing near the joint with a young mechanic, showing him how to seat a comparator bracket without loading the probe. He had not come upstairs to defend himself. He was where the facts were. That did more to shame her than an accusation would have. She took the incident draft, removed the pen clipped to it, and pushed the papers back toward legal. "We are not signing this." Reed stared at her. "Adelaide, we need to control exposure." "No," she said, and her voice had changed. It was quieter, not softer. "We need to stop confusing exposure with accountability." She ordered all technical records open to Caleb's investigation team, placed Blaine and Reed on administrative leave pending board review, and directed that the final incident record state, plainly, that a pre-demonstration field warning had been disregarded. Permanent restraints had not been installed despite completed documentation, and the monitoring system had failed because it lacked fixed external reference points. One of the attorneys began to caution her about admissions. Adelaide looked at him with a weary steadiness. The building moved 3 inches in front of a client, a camera crew, our board, and half our engineering staff. Reality has already made the admission. The board meeting lasted into the night. Eli was called in after 9, wearing the same work shirt, now clean at the cuffs but still creased from 15 hours in the plant. He expected to stand at the wall. Adelaide pointed to the empty seat nearest the window. the one Blaine had used that morning. Eli hesitated only a moment before sitting. He did not make a speech. He laid out his evidence in order: notebook measurements, gauge reading, joint marks, photos, frequency calculation, receiving manifest, missing installation record, and recovery sequence. He spoke with no bitterness. That made some people look even more ashamed. Caleb addressed the board after him and stated 3 conditions for Behringer Continental to continue negotiations: removal of Reed and Blaine from Foundry West Authority, creation of an independent verification office reporting directly to a board safety committee, and a written right for any worker, engineer, mechanic, janitor, contractor, apprentice, to halt a production run when presenting physical evidence of an unresolved safety concern. "You can build the most advanced plant in the country," Caleb said, "and still fail because the only people allowed to be right are the ones with offices." The board vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Blaine's contract was terminated for cause pending legal review. Reed's followed. There would be investigations, insurance disputes, angry letters, quiet settlements, and months of institutional discomfort. But that night, at least, the official story and the physical story were allowed to occupy the same room. Adelaide turned to Eli in front of the board and said, "I dismissed your warning when I had authority to stop the demonstration. I allowed credentials to outweigh evidence. I am sorry, Eli." She used his first name, not his job category. Eli looked at her, then at the people watching him, as if expecting either anger or grace performed for their relief. He gave them neither performance. "Make it harder to do next time," he said. That was all. 3 days later, Adelaide offered Eli a new position: Director of Field Verification and Safety, with authority to stop any test, demonstration, or production run at Foundry West based on physical evidence that had not been explained. The offer came with more money than Eli had ever made, an office he did not want, and a reporting line above plant operations. He took the folder home without signing it. That evening, Lila sat at the kitchen table doing homework while Eli reheated soup. Their house was small, with tired cabinets and a back door that stuck in damp weather. Mara's photo still stood on the shelf by the window, smiling in the blue dress she had worn to Lila's 5th-grade concert. Eli had once believed grief would get lighter if he carried it long enough. It had not. He had simply grown around it, the way trees grow around fence wire, holding pain and life in the same wood. Lila looked up from her algebra. "They offered you something?" He set the folder on the table. "A job. A better one? More responsibility. That means more calls during dinner. Maybe." She opened the folder before he could stop her, scanned numbers she was old enough to understand, and went quiet. "Dad." He stirred the soup. "It's not decided." "Why wouldn't you?" He leaned against the counter. How could he explain that being lifted up by the same institution that had tried to flatten him did not feel simple? That money could fix the roof, replace the truck's transmission, and let Lila choose a college without him calculating loan payments at midnight. But it could not buy back the dignity of being believed before disaster? That he feared becoming a symbol they could polish while nothing underneath changed? Lila closed the folder gently. "Mom would say, 'Take it if you can protect people.'" Eli looked toward Mara's photo. "Your mom would also say read every page before signing." Lila smiled. "She would say that first." The next morning, Eli returned to Adelaide with 2 conditions. Tessa Vale would lead the independent instrumentation division, with budget and authority equal to engineering, because she had protected the truth when silence would have been safer for her career. And every safety observation filed at Foundry West would carry the name and role of the person who identified it on the cover page, not buried in an appendix, so that no one could turn a worker into support personnel after the fact. Adelaide agreed without negotiation. Eli studied her for a second, surprised by the absence of resistance. She said, "I'm learning where the real sensors should have been." He signed. The first training session he led was not in a classroom, but at the expansion joint in Bay 3. He set a chalk box on the workbench beside a digital laser tracker worth more than his truck and waited while engineers, operators, apprentices, supervisors, and executives gathered around. Some of the men who had laughed at him were there. Eli did not ask them to apologize. An apology demanded in public could become another kind of theater, and he had no appetite for theater. He drew a simple rectangle on the concrete, then a smaller one inside it. "This is the slab," he said. "This is the plant around it. If all your instruments live here," he tapped the inner rectangle, "what do they know about this?" He tapped the outside. No one answered at first. The quiet was uncomfortable, but not useless. "Technology didn't fail because it was too advanced," he continued. "It failed because people gave it the wrong world to measure. Experience didn't win because chalk is magic. Chalk won because it crossed a boundary the system forgot existed. Every measurement needs a reference point that is not part of the thing being measured. In factories, in companies, sometimes in people." That last sentence was not in his notes. Adelaide, standing near the back, heard it and lowered her eyes. Over the following months, Foundry West changed in ways that did not make good marketing photographs, but made better work. External reference stations were anchored to the fixed foundation. Mechanical comparators were installed at every major joint. Stop work authority was printed on badges, repeated in orientations, and tested in drills where executives were not told in advance who would be allowed to halt the line. The first time an apprentice used it, his hands shook. He had found an oil trace under press 8, a crescent-shaped stain small enough to wipe away with one rag. Under the old culture, he might have cleaned it and stayed quiet. Under the new one, he reported it, and the line stopped for inspection. The problem turned out to be a hairline crack in a fitting that would have failed under load within a week. Eli watched from 20 feet away as a senior engineer thanked the apprentice and taped a bright tag beside the stain. No one erased it. No one called it panic. The mark stayed until the cause was understood. That afternoon, Eli carried the cracked fitting to his office, set it beside his father's old dial gauge, and thought of how dignity often entered a room quietly, disguised as inconvenience. 6 months after the failed demonstration, Foundry West ran all 12 presses at full synchronized capacity for the first time under the Behringer contract. There were no banners that day, no hidden unfinished walls, no speeches about perfection. Caleb Behringer attended in the same brown jacket. Adelaide stood beside him in a hard hat. Tessa monitored the external references, and Eli watched from the floor with his arms folded, close enough to feel the machines through his boots. The presses cycled once, twice, then into steady rhythm. Aluminum blanks moved through the line and came out clean. The comparators held. The external sensors held. The slab stayed centered, not because anyone believed harder, but because the anchors were real. The measurements were honest, and the people nearest the work had been given permission to tell the truth before the truth had to shout. At the end of the run, Caleb signed the final production release. Adelaide asked Eli whether he wanted the original chalk mark preserved in a glass panel near the visitor's entrance. He looked at the yellow remnant still faintly visible in the shadow of column D14, the part Reed's shoe had missed. For a moment, he saw that morning again. The smirk, the smear, the red needle trembling, the terrible patience of physics. Then he shook his head. "Don't turn a mistake into a monument," he said. "Put up a rule instead." So near the entrance to the verification bay, on a plain steel plaque with no logo, Halcyon installed one sentence: Evidence does not lose its value because the person who found it lacks a title. Eli never stopped carrying chalk. He did not need it as often, but the small white stick remained in his shirt pocket beside a pencil and a folded photo of Lila and Mara at the county fair. On a Thursday evening in late October, he clocked out at his regular time and drove home along the river road under a sky the color of pewter. The leaves had turned hard gold along the ditches. His old pickup rattled at 45 miles an hour, still needing a transmission more than he wanted to admit, but he no longer felt the same knot in his chest when bills came in the mail. At home, Lila was at the stove burning the first pancake because she had grown impatient waiting for Saturday. "Don't say anything," she warned as smoke curled toward the ceiling. Eli hung his jacket on the chair, took the spatula from her hand, and flipped the blackened pancake onto a plate. "I wasn't going to." "You were thinking it." "Thinking is still allowed in this house." She noticed the chalk when he reached for the butter. "Still carrying it?" He pulled the piece from his pocket. It was shorter now, rounded from use. Dust gathered in the seams of his fingers. He set it on the counter between them. "People look sooner than they used to." Lila touched it with one fingertip, leaving a pale mark on her skin. "Good," she said. It was such a small word for everything it held. The plant, the warning, the men who laughed, the woman who learned, the workers who kept their jobs, the father who came home tired but whole. Eli looked at his daughter in the warm kitchen light and thought that maybe justice, when it was real, did not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it came as a line no one erased. Sometimes it came as a child who still expected pancakes. Sometimes it came as a room full of educated people falling silent long enough to hear the truth from the man they had mistaken for background noise. The next week, the apprentice near Press 8 found another mark, this time a faint gray dusting under a rail mount. He called it in without waiting half a day. The line stopped. Engineers came. Tessa measured from the fixed points. Eli crouched beside the apprentice and handed him the chalk. "Circle what you saw," he said. The young man did, awkwardly at first, then with a steadier hand. People gathered, not to laugh, not to erase, but to understand. Above them screens glowed, lasers tracked, cameras recorded, and a factory that had once measured only itself now held fast to the world outside it. Eli stood, wiped his palms on his work pants, and watched the chalk circle remain bright against the floor until the answer was found. This time, nobody stepped on it. This time, nobody laughed. Sometimes the quietest voice carries the wisdom that keeps an entire world standing. In the story of factory mechanic Eli Mercer, his single chalk line, drawn at dawn across a hair-thin concrete seam, warned executives that the new billion-dollar press line was literally shifting under their feet. They laughed, erased the mark, and pushed ahead until the floor lurched 3 inches and only Eli's steady courage guided the team to safety. His experience reminds us that titles don't validate truth. Evidence does. Real leadership begins with listening, especially to people on the ground who see danger first. When we honor competence over ego, companies thrive, families stay whole, and ordinary heroes come home for Saturday morning pancakes. If this lesson stirred something in you, share your thoughts below. Have you ever had to speak up when no one wanted to hear? Let's learn from each other's moments of quiet bravery. And if you want more true-to-life stories that prove integrity still wins, hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. Your support helps this channel keep shining a light on voices that matter. Don't forget to leave a comment. I read every one and can't wait to hear your perspective.